one of the piece of work that was formed part of the original Built to Last study was a study of the different typologies of houses, the historic houses in Dublin. So it was somewhere an age range between roughly 1700 and the interwar period, 1945. So we're looking at, if you like, the traditional building stock. So I suppose that the purpose of that was to identify the range of characteristics that you're going to face up against, I guess, in terms of retrofit. This is just an example of one of the things we looked at, where we're looking at the variety of scale of, what are known to be houses in Dublin. So, like, for example, Dáil Éireann is a house, it's a 7-bay mansion, if you like, but like so is the artisan cottages or the Cabra housing and so on. So this image here is just, we're trying to capture the range and scale that you can come up against, that you can come up against in terms of what is a house in Dublin. So on the top left, we have a mansion house in Henrietta Street, and the bottom left is Irvine Terrace in Irvine Terrace. And I suppose, it's just curious that you could take the floor plan of Irvine Terrace and drop it into the front room of Henrietta Street. It's just literally drop it in. So like, in terms of, say, floor area, like, it's 4 times the area in terms of the ground floor area of those two houses. But when you take that across the overall floor area, across the multi levels and the volume, you have a difference in factor of, say, 22 in floor area, a difference in volume of a factor of 30. So they're two very, very different buildings, and those characteristics should inform some of the decisions that will be made. Like, take a simple example, the impact of a chimney as a cold bridge going through roof insulation is, say, more dramatic in terms of the overall heat loss of a small building than a very large building. And then the top right there is just capturing sort of that information in graphic format. So I suppose just to clarify, there's a range of 15 case studies. 8 of the case studies are buildings where a retrofit took place. So in other words, at the time of the study, the works had been finished, they were done. We interviewed homeowners. We carried out a BR assessment of the building as it was retrofitted, and then we sort of matched that with a BR assessment before it was retrofitted to get some statistics on the level of improvement. So these were case studies where we're looking at the building, we're talking to the homeowner. If they have energy bills, if they have a couple of years of energy bills, we're comparing that to the BR data and looking at, how does the reality match up to the actual calculated savings and so on in terms of energy reduction. So these were the 8 where works had happened, and there was like an interview process, and it's more, I guess, a soft approach in terms of understanding how the homeowners felt about the impact. Did they feel it was an impact? Was it positive and all that kind of thing? Whereas the other 7, we call them unretrofitted case studies. These ended up being more sort of technical studies. So we took the buildings, and Joe and Building Life Consultancy and the team were doing things like organizing air pressure testing, in situ U-value measurements, hydrothermal assessment of different things. So these became much more, I guess, sort of scientific or analytical. So there wasn't retrofit works happened to these buildings, but they were used as, if you like, a model to study. Again, we're trying to capture a range of buildings. So again, our age range again, these was from the Georgian in Northgate Georgia Street, which is about 1780, up to Johnny Carney House, which is, I think, about 1935 or 1940 or something like that. And again, with the unretrofitted case studies, we have a range which is Lennox Street would be the oldest. I think it's about 1830, 1840, up to again Dingle Road Cabra into war housing. This was the original way it was published. It's been reformatted for the website, but this was the sort of we had a kind of a core data page which tried to capture, we wanted to capture the plan form, which is very important as part of its typology. And then the top left, there was always a little urban place map, which just situated it in terms of its urban context. One of the topics that came up was microclimate, and it was interesting in one of the case studies where people, certain orientation within Donnycarney, were feeling cold more than others. And so I think like the context, the setting within the city was an important thing. The table on the right here was one of the key pieces in each case study, which I think will be in the website. So it basically summarizes the findings of the BER data. So Michael Hanratty and IHEO were largely responsible for this piece of work. So they took each case study, they did it before and after BER, and they outputted this data. So we have, for example, in this one, which is Albany Road in Ranelagh, there was an existing BER of E3, and following the energy upgrading works, it improved to a C3. And then there was an estimate of the energy savings in monetary terms. This is obviously monetary terms of 2013 or so. And then I suppose one of the important things we'll come back to later is this idea of the form factor, which is the heat loss area. So the area of your roof, your walls, your windows, your floor, divided by the floor area of the house. And this is important in terms of understanding where the heat is going, and also the impact of, for example, wall insulation. Similarly, there's a factor for the window area. So again, how much of the floor area in percentage terms is glass? And then also we looked at the percentage of wall area over total heat loss area. So without getting muddled in all this, that's basically the total heat loss area, the building, just the roof, the walls, etc., the percentage of that which is the wall. So again, these little figures that we touch on them as we go along, but they're I think this is one sort of key important things that come out of the whole study. So they were the BER results which came out for the retrofitted case studies. So again, we're looking at them when the job is finished, and there's some kind of respectable results. I mean, like the two top left Georgian buildings achieving C1s and C2s of fairly benign interventions. Moving up to the more deeper retrofits, which were possible in the later kind of housing. So I'm not going to delve into each case study and overwhelm people with too much information. So we're just going to take one interesting fact from each one, and it might just whet people's appetite to sort of explore it a bit more. So this is a Georgian house on Northgate Georgia Street. It was interesting insofar it was occupied in its entirety by a single family. Most of the buildings are kind of partly occupied, or there's a mixture of commercial and maybe apartments on the ground floor and an office use. But this building is entirely occupied by a family, which was interesting in terms of mapping energy use and comparing it to the other houses. What's interesting about it is it has the most efficient form factor of all the buildings. So in other words, the Georgian building, the 4-story over basement Georgian building, is enclosing the space, floor area, more efficiently than any other of the typologies. So you'll see that this form factor, it's 1.03 in this building, and it rises up to say 2.5 or 3 in a sort of a detached 2-story house. So that's a significant characteristic that contributes to the energy efficiency of the building. And what happened in this case study was very, very benign. There was attic insulation, and there was an upgrade of the boiler and the heating controls. There was no wall insulation, no secondary glazing or anything like that. And the fact that it's achieving a C2, I think, is respectable. So again, we're looking at the characteristics of the building and how that kind of relates to its BER. Again, this is another later Georgian building. It's about 1830 or so on Upper Leeson Street. It's a different again. It's a different shape of building. It's just a simple 2-story. Simple 2-story house. So you see then the form factor is different. It's 1.89, so it's much higher. So it's not enclosing. It's not as efficient in terms of its enclosure. Again, this efficiency with the Northgate George Street building has a lot to do with the fact that it's terraced. So when it's terraced, the amount of external wall area is dramatically reduced. So, but this one is terraced as well, but it's got a higher form factor, which has got to do with the fact that it's two-story with these various projections at the back. It had a very efficient glazing ratio, so only 12% of the floor area is glazing, which other buildings are much higher. I suppose what's interesting about this one is that, again, the works are very, very benign. There was no wall insulation to the principal rooms. There was no secondary glazing or alteration of the windows. They were refurbished and draft proofed. The two little returns at the rear had no wall features and kind of received a calcitherm wall lining, calcitherm thermal lining. So I think the fact that these two little outshoots were buffering the back of the building, and then it's only really the fact that the front wall is losing heat, your roof is insulated, and the suspended floor was insulated with fiber insulation. You know, again, it's performing quite well for what it is and what was done to it. And again, I suppose it's pointing to the idea of like just looking at your overall looking at the overall characteristics of the building, not jumping straight into a wall insulation approach because we feel we have to insulate walls. Often buildings like this perform, you know, adequately well for their significance in their period, as they are. This is a Victorian house. There's two Albany Road case studies. One is this one, which is about 1890. It's a Victorian. There's a later one about 1930, which is an interwar house. Again, this house, there was a couple of things here. There was a package of works done, mainly concentrated around the return, where we could apply calcitherm inside the attic. I think underfloor heating was introduced to the solid floor of the return, and then there was works to the windows. But there was an attempt, I suppose, to do a package of work which would not create a lock-in effect. So the works were kind of concentrated in the return, and then the homeowner wanted to kind of see how that improved comfort levels, and then possibly look at a later phase of works at the front of the building. So again, it's a progressive approach. It's a bit like the building passport idea, the energy upgrade passport idea, where you're not doing things which lock in, making a better improvement at a later stage. There was an issue with the front suspended timber floor. There was a pre-existing issue with dry rot in the building. The front suspended floor was insulated with fiber insulation and a wood fiber board on the underside because the cavity was deep enough to get below the floor. Within a year and a bit later, there was a problem with fruiting cellar rot in the house. So the issue, I guess, so the point here is that there was, as it turned out, very elevated moisture levels in the rising walls, which is attributable to drainage issues at the front of the house. This approach has been done in other buildings and it's worked perfectly well. What happened here was that there was a residual vulnerability within the building in terms of the moisture levels. And I suppose the conditions should have been more fully or thoroughly understood. And, you know, not to rely on sort of third parties who, you know, might tell you that the dry rot has been addressed and so on. So Griffith Avenue, you can't see the dates. I think this one was about 1930. So yeah, Griffith Avenue was laid out about 1925, which I suppose makes sense. Again, a simple little retrofit project. What's interesting here is that the homeowners, there were two, I think there were two sisters or so living together, and they valued the facade. So, you know, Griffith Avenue is an attractive avenue, but they put a value on their facade and said, look, we want the house to be warmer, but we want to retain the simple as it is, we want to retain the facade without changing it. So there was a hybrid approach. There was external insulation to the sidewall and the rear of the house, and the front received internal wall insulation with an overlap. So yeah, I think just again, we don't have to jump into a single approach. I think you can do hybrid things. You can do different things in different parts of the building that, you know, maybe keep the principal character. Again, you wouldn't do this to maybe an older house, to a Georgian or whatever else, but this period of house, we kind of felt it was acceptable. I mean, the corner you're looking at there it's externally insulated as it returns around the corner on the side gable wall. And I think the result is acceptable in terms of what it retains. This was a deep retrofit of the other Albany Road house, which is 1935, I think. So it was one of the first Enerfit retrofits. So an Enerfit retrofit is taking an existing building to sort of near passive house standard. I think, as I understand it, you can't get all the way there, but you get to a level that's pretty good, or close to the passive house standard. So the building was upgraded from a G to an A3. It was extended and extended to the rear. So the rear received, say, an element of new build, which was externally insulated. And I suppose there was again a desire to retain the street side character, not to interfere with the appearance of the building at the front. So in this one, what I found interesting was just the insulation approach. There was a variety of different insulation approaches used in response to different conditions. So, for example, you could go with the full external insulation at the rear. At the front, there was internal insulation. At the stair wall, where the stairs is on an external wall, there's a thinner, I think, aerogel insulation used. So you can temper and vary your approach. It doesn't have to be the same to the whole building. You can modify it, and you can take something like this, which is it adds a lot to the street. It's very much part of the character of the area. But behind that, there's a full Enerfit upgrade. This one is, I suppose, slightly controversial, but I think it's worth talking about and showing to people. It's a building from, again, interwar period in Dublin 14. The top left is the building as it originally was, and the other images are after it's been externally insulated. So again, in heritage terms, this is controversial because this isn't original craftsmanship. This isn't original features. This is very much recreation or reconstruction work above the insulation thermal layer. The owner was an architect. He was a principal in one of the large practices, and he very much wanted to make his house warm, but he wanted to do it very well and not lose any character. So that is all external insulation work, including the brick corbels, the profiled corbels at the springing point of the arch in the top, on the bottom right. So that was all done with brick slips or pistol bricks, where they were cut into L's and formed and sort of laid over the insulation. So I suppose, I think the external insulation wave is happening all over Dublin. In some areas, it's having adverse impacts, particularly in the mid-century, the 20th century public housing schemes like Marino and Cabra and so on. And sometimes it's done well and sometimes it's done not so well. But I think it's happening. And I suppose looking at this kind of work, I mean, there's been a high level of attention to detail here, and there's been a very strong attempt made to do it properly. Again, the impact of it, again, looking at the wall area to the factors here, where we're up at 2.5 for the form factor, and half the heat loss area is the walls. So again, there's a strong argument for addressing walls in a house like this, which is detached, whereas that changes maybe in the terrace houses we looked at. This is Belton Park Villas, Donecarney. I suppose just quickly, this is what was interesting here is that there's I'm just going to check time and see how I'm doing. What's interesting is that there was a group of neighbours, and I think they happened in sequence, but they got the same contractor and the houses. So I suppose, I mean, there is an erosion of character in terms of the loss of the dash render and so on, but I mean, the group approach is better in some ways than the insulation stepping in and out with every second or third house. Again, what's interesting here is that the energy savings didn't, in real terms, didn't really improve. There's a few different variables happening with that, and again, like looking at your fuel bills isn't always reliable. But I think one of the things was that, again, it's a terrace house, and maybe the the wall insulation is having less impact than maybe the homeowners expected. There was a suspended timber floor in the ground floor, which wasn't insulated. So again, you have heat loss through the floor. You've also have a lot of air infiltration, which would have a significant impact. So again, jumping to the wall insulation approach, maybe without doing the other things, isn't maybe the best in terms of the order of priority. So just going to move on. These are the unretrofitted case studies. So again, I did most of the interviews for the previous ones, so I'm less familiar with these. And again, they're more sort of technical, but I'll give you my understanding of some of the kind of points that come out of them. So this is Lennox Street. So it's a Georgian, late Georgian from about 1837. One of the deliverables of the project was to come up with a survey of the air tightness characteristics of the housing stock, the traditional housing stock that we have. So the table on the bottom is it's an early version of the table. It's not completed. It's the one from the original study. But the green dots are the defaults that you use in deep, which for a solid masonry wall is roughly about 2.1. The blue dots are a calculated U value where you take the thickness of the wall, the composition in terms of the type of masonry units, and the percentage or volume of mortar, and you do a more detailed calculation of the actual wall. So the blue dots show you that they're sort of up and down, but the majority are lower than what the deep default is. And then the red bars are an in situ U value measurement. So there's a way of measuring the actual U value of the wall with thermocouples, which is done in the cold season, so you get a differential across the wall, and the red bars are arranged so that you don't get a definitive value. You get a value which has got an order of what would you call it, uncertainty. So again, the key point of this is that the walls generally perform, when you take the measurement, they perform much better than the default, maybe by half. So for example, the one on the left, the Henrietta Street building, you'll be using a default. If you're doing a BER in this building, you'd be using a default of 2 for the walls, whereas the measurement was about 1.09, I think, or something like that. So again, the message is that the walls generally perform better than expected. This is Irvine Terrace. So I mean, I think it's a small, again, a very different type of house. It's very compact, little cottage. I suppose one of the things that was looked at here is the existing conditions again, like what are the existing conditions of the building, what sort of stresses is it under. And in this house, there's no footpath, and if you like road drainage, there's the water is discharging directly from the roofs onto the footpath. So I think what was found in this one was that there was a very high level of moisture stress in that front wall, and there was different solutions looked at what could be done to address it. Some might be kind of public works, some might be internal, and then there's a response in terms of the type of insulation you're using. So I think there was a tradical hemp lime proposed, which was something that would be very hygroscopic, I presume, and it would help to alleviate the particular conditions of the wall. So again, looking at your conditions and looking at the type of materials and solution that you want to use. This is Brighton Road, Victorian house in Rathgar. Again, it's the 2-story over elevated basement type. Traditional buildings, the top left is a map that the technical team sort of put together. So they're mapping, blue dots are taking SEAI BER data, and they're mapping it, I get this right now, they're mapping the form factor on the bottom. So the form factor is the efficiency of the enclosure. So 1 is our Georgian efficient terraced house, and then 2, 3 is getting into your detached houses. So they're mapping the form factor against the air permeability of houses. So the blue dots are SEI data, which kind of show what sort of a spread you get. And then the technical case studies, which are these ones, are mapped on that. So you're looking at the relationship between the form factor and the air permeability. So you're looking at the 20th century Albany Road is maybe an anomaly because it's become a deep retrofit. But say looking at Dingle Road in Cabra, looking at the one above at Ashfield Avenue, it's got a Q50 value of I think 7. They're like an air tightness of 4 is very respectable for a building that hasn't been built as an airtight house. So again, we're looking at what are the air tightness characteristics. So moving up towards the top of that graph, so the worst ones in terms of air permeability is this one, Brighton Road, and we think it's because of the little box extension that was done probably in the 90s. It's like a rationale type framed thing. So it's nicely put together, nicely built and designed, but it was of its time and it wasn't built to an airtightness standard. And then at the very top is Aylesbury Gardens, which we'll come to, which had existing steel frame windows. So we wanted to get a handle on what is the typical characteristics of the houses in terms of airtightness. And the screen grab on the bottom is just an article from Passive House Plus around the time of the study, which was really interesting. It's an article by a guy called Paul Overy, and he talked about the whole concept that you can often in an Irish winter, and again, we're talking about our climate and what's particular about Ireland as opposed to anywhere else. He was talking in this article about how the energy demand can be higher in the shoulder seasons, in other words, October, November, February, March, than in December, because you can get windier weather in the shoulder seasons, you get more still weather when it's very cold. And there was actually greater heat loss in the houses that they studied during the windy weather, not during the cold weather. So it's telling you that we're suffering from more heat loss by air infiltration than by heat loss through sort of walls and roofs and so on. So again, air tightness is critical to the whole equation. And again, it's the whole thing about not jumping straight to wall insulation, that there is other things that are more important or maybe should be prioritized. Finlay, so this is Joe Little's project. I'm not going to go into the technical side of it because he'll completely blow me away later, so I won't even try that. So again, it was a deep retrofit. I suppose what I find interesting is, Joe had a sense of, it's not a protected structure, but it is in the Z2 zoning within Dublin, which seeks to kind of, protect the character of areas. But I mean, there was little things that I know he considered at the beginning. I think some of the homeowners in the streets, they might have lowered the floor level and squeezed an extra floor in under the roof. But Joe was very strong at the beginning that he wanted to keep the original volume of the front room, the high ceiling height, and the original plan form, which is that's drawn from the Architectural Archive, which is the original Dublin artisan dwelling plan form. So as far as I understand, the original plan form of the front of the building was retained and it was extended to the rear. So I mean, you can do things like plan form is important, even if you're doing a deep retrofit, keeping a sense of the spaces within the original house, and even a small little detail like the roof. The roof was reslated, but the original ridge tiles, the clay ridge tiles, were retained and mortared in. And it can be a battle getting roofers to. Most roofers want to use dry fix systems these days because they're just faster and easier, and it can be an argument to get guys to mortar on tiles, especially maybe in cold weather. So I mean, the fact that these little details were retained, it all adds to the I suppose the sense of character of the original building. That's a house around the corner, so it's showing the mass concrete kind of large aggregate construction of the house, which is interesting. And Joe will go into it more later, but as far as I understand, the insulation approach was to treat that as a masonry rubble wall. So in terms of its porosity and breathability, that was a factor, even though it's modern concrete construction. Ashfield Avenue, Ranelagh, it's a 1900 late Victorian. Again, this is a I get this right now, a hygrothermal assessment of the junction between the external wall and the floor, which Building Life Consultancy and Joe did at the time. So in simple terms, what we're looking at is the building has been cement pointed, and they're measuring here the this is a Carson tube, and they're measuring the rate of absorption of that brick, of that facade. So some bricks, some walls will absorb a lot of moisture. Some bricks will absorb more moisture than others. That's a factor in your insulation approach. The more absorbent the wall is, the more moisture it will take up, the more hygroscopic your insulation approach should be to allow the drying of the wall on the inside face of the wall. So actually, I'll start with this column here. This is a modeling of the wall as it would have been originally constructed. So it would have had lime mortar pointing and so on. That's current, is it? Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. So the left is the original condition. So when it was built, so we're looking at lime mortar joints. The wall has a higher degree of breathability than it has in its current condition, because we have cement mortar joints and possibly impervious linings on the inside of the wall. So you can see that the moisture stress level is rising in its current condition compared to its original condition. The next column, where it's sort of looks like Hill 16 on Ireland Sunday, it's the blue is kind of representing the sort of humidity, the moisture level in the wall. So in a typical renovation where you might use a vapor closed insulation approach with a vapor barrier and so on, this is the effect, based on the hydrothermal assessment, this is the effect it will have on the wall. It's going to increase the moisture stress in the wall. That's if you do it that way. If you do it with a hygroscopic materials and materials that will let the wall breathe externally, so I presume here you're reinstating your lime joints, you're using a hydrothermal insulation, you have a limecrete slab. You can see that the moisture stress, the moisture levels in the wall are reducing back to its original construction. So it's just, again, it's a little detail, but it's something that's important to, I think, all the house typologies, is the importance of the materials that you use and how they relate to moisture management within the walls. This little one, Aylesbury Gardens, what I find interesting about this one is there's an elderly couple who live here, and they've been there since, I think, 1971. The house has the original steel framed windows, and they love the steel framed windows. They don't want to let them go. So much so that when they built a small little extension at the rear, they salvaged 2 of the windows from the oaks that were broken out, and they used this material to repair and, you know, weld in sections to the windows. So they've made an enormous effort over their lifetime to retain the windows. They appreciate the character of them, and they appreciate that they're very much part of the house. But the windows are a problem. There was air tightness testing done, and there was thermal imaging, and you know, I suppose it's obvious that there's also, I think, an anemometer that could measure the rate of air coming through between the frames. So it's obvious that the windows are a big problem. And I think some of the solutions looked at were, some of the solutions looked at were secondary glazing, so not, you know, interfering with the glass and so on. But I suppose it's an example of, like, just the care that some people appreciate. I mean, this house it's 20th century, but I believe most of the other houses in the terrace, the steel windows are gone. So this makes this more rare, more important. And but there's just a sense that the people kind of value what they have, and regardless of what they feel they should do, they want to retain them. And I think that's kind of just valuable in terms of even homeowners' feedback and how people kind of look at their homes. For Dingle Road in Cabra, again, Cabra houses, they're very simple little buildings. They're plain rendered front with, you know, simple plaster band and the concrete cantilever canopy. But I suppose what's significant about Cabra is just the sense of placemaking and urban design, that when you look at for example, the radial layout here in relation to obviously the church at the time was the center of the entire community, and there's a very clear aim here, like, to create something of, you know, that's distinct. And you get this in Marino as well, where the radial planform and the greens and everything else, small little simple building units can make something important. So, you know, it might seem very modest in most people's, or not a value in maybe a lot of people's minds, but overall, in terms of an entity, these estates are significant. And for example, like the external insulation approaches that we talked about, like that can have an impact, and it is having an impact on a lot of the estates in Dublin. I don't know anecdotally in Marino that I know an architect doing some work there, and I think DCC are refusing external insulation on some of the applications where it's called up, and then they're appealing it, and Bord Pleanála are granting it. So there's obviously a bit of a conflict in terms of planning policy, but I think, you know, we should think maybe carefully about it. This was a study which formed part of Built to Last, with just a concept or an idea. It might be aspirational in terms of trying to round up an entire terrace to work together, but the idea was that if we have to externally insulate these buildings, could you do it in groups and blocks where you have more control of the features, you have more control of the details, and you know, you can come up with a coherent entity at the end of as the end product, as opposed to, you know, individual sort of individual piecemeal upgrades. So again, Joe and the team, they look very carefully at all this. So like about the details, you for example, again, each characteristic, all these house types are different. These houses have a in situ cast concrete eaves, which is a problem in terms of thermal continuity, where you have external insulation, you're trying to join it up with roof insulation. So again, they look very carefully at this difficult, for example, this difficult detail of the bell cast slope of the roof. And I think this received an aerogel overlay over the concrete eaves. So again, looking at the difficult details, looking at, for example, the cold bridging effect of the canopies. I mean, again, they're just simple little concrete canopies, but I think they shouldn't be lost. And there was an approach here, like, could you insulate it with an aerogel blanket and keep the thinness of it, but you know, mitigate the cold bridge. So like, I think, I mean, this might never happen, but I suppose it's talking about looking at these difficult details that should be done to retain character. There might be more work, that might be kind of difficult, but I think it needs an extra sort of effort or push to achieve this, so that we get this balance between the character, the heritage value, and achieving kind of energy savings. So we're in a housing crisis at the moment, and sometimes in a crisis situation, like, bad decisions can be made. And I think there's a retrofit wave. I get a sense is about to happen. On the news this morning, there's money from I think 150 million from the COVID fund is going to be put into renovations, and it's all positive that we're trying to renovate derelict buildings and everything, but there's a feeling that there's going to be between the grants and everything else, there's going to be a lot of work done in the next couple of years. That's a slide, a tweet from the Dublin Civic Trust from actually 5 years ago. It's a skip on Capel Street, and there is an early 17th century, 1600s staircase, and there's oak elements in it as well. That was in a skip outside Capel Street. I don't know if the building was protected or if the people that did it even were aware of what they were doing, but there's a significant risk of the wrong thing being done with all this. And I think that careful attention to detail in terms of the thermal upgrade, but also in terms of the significance of the building, what you have in terms of, even if it's very simple features, it's important to look at that carefully and to find the balance. And that's it. Thank you very much.